What if the loneliness you've been trying to escape is not the wound, but the weapon? What if the silence that scares you, the empty room, the unread messages, the weekends that feel too still, are not signs that life has abandoned you, but signs that life is finally forcing you to meet the person you've been avoiding? And what if the world keeps teaching you to fear being alone for one reason, because a person who no longer needs constant approval becomes very difficult to control? In this video, we're going to break that open. Not with cliches. Not with the usual soft advice about loving yourself more. But by looking at solitude the way the Stoics understood it, and by exposing the strange social theater of modern life, where people perform connection, perform confidence, perform happiness, while quietly depending on noise just to avoid hearing themselves think. We'll talk about why being alone feels so painful at first, why most people confuse loneliness with failure, why silence reveals things distraction was hiding, and why the people who learn to stand on their own often become the strongest, clearest, and most dangerous people in the room. And near the end, I'm going to come back to one mistake almost everyone makes when they first try to embrace solitude, a mistake that turns reflection into self-punishment instead of strength. So if you've been in a season where life feels quieter than you expected, stay with me. Because this may be the moment you stop calling it abandonment, and start calling it training. There's a lie most people absorb long before they're old enough to question it. The lie is this: if you are alone, something must be wrong. Maybe you weren't chosen. Maybe you weren't loved enough. Maybe you weren't interesting enough, attractive enough, successful enough, connected enough. Maybe the silence in your life means you are falling behind while everyone else is being welcomed into the warmth of belonging. That lie is repeated everywhere. In movies where the hero is always surrounded by allies. In social media feeds filled with group photos, curated laughter, proof of invitations, proof of relevance, proof that everyone belongs somewhere. In casual conversations where people talk as if being constantly busy, constantly reached for, constantly included is the ultimate sign that life is working. And if you sit with that messaging long enough, you begin to interpret solitude as evidence against yourself. You don't just feel alone. You feel defective. But that interpretation is not wisdom. It is conditioning. And the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. Because the same society that tells you to be yourself also punishes you the moment your real self becomes inconvenient. It tells you to be authentic, but only in ways that remain socially acceptable. It tells you to speak your truth, but only if that truth does not disturb the performance. It praises individuality right up until individuality stops being decorative and starts becoming independent. That is where the mask slips. Because a person who is comfortable alone is no longer easy to herd. A person who can sit in silence without rushing to fill it is harder to sell to, harder to shame, harder to bait, harder to manipulate with trends, outrage, status games, or fear of exclusion. A person who does not panic when the room gets quiet starts seeing what other people are doing when they talk too much, post too much, flatter too much, chase too much. And once you see that, you can never fully unsee it. This is where solitude begins to change shape. At first, it feels like deprivation. Later, it starts to feel like revelation. Because when the noise drops, something uncomfortable happens. You hear yourself. Not the polished version of you. Not the social version. Not the version built to survive family expectations, workplace politics, romantic insecurity, or digital comparison. You hear the one underneath. And for many people, that is exactly why being alone feels unbearable in the beginning. It is not the absence of people that hurts most. It is the absence of distraction. When there is no one to text, no feed to scroll, no chatter to dissolve yourself into, you come face to face with everything that has been waiting in the dark. Regret. Envy. Unprocessed grief. Old shame. The quiet suspicion that you have been performing strength instead of building it. The realization that some of your relationships were never love, only mutual avoidance. The realization that some of your ambition was never vision, only a desperate attempt to outrun the feeling of not being enough. That is why solitude feels sharp. It exposes what noise was protecting you from. But that exposure is not cruelty. It is clarity. The Stoics understood something about human beings that modern culture keeps trying to bury. The quality of your life is inseparable from the quality of your inner world. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. That sounds simple until you realize how rarely most people are alone long enough to examine what those thoughts actually are. Most people inherit a mind the way they inherit a crowded room. Voices everywhere. Opinions everywhere. Urgencies everywhere. Very little space. And because they never step back, they mistake mental noise for identity. They think every impulse is truth. Every insecurity is prophecy. Every emotional reaction is proof. Solitude interrupts that. It creates distance between you and the world that has been narrating you. And in that distance, you begin to notice things. You notice how often you reached for approval before reaching for truth. You notice how many choices were made to avoid rejection, not to honor conviction. You notice how many conversations exhausted you because you were shrinking yourself in real time just to keep peace with people who were never truly at peace with themselves. And once that awareness begins, a new kind of strength becomes possible. Not loud strength. Not theatrical strength. Not the kind that needs to be seen flexing in public. A quieter one. A deeper one. The kind that does not tremble every time someone misunderstands you. The kind that does not collapse when attention disappears. The kind that can lose a room and still keep a soul. That kind of strength is forged in solitude. Think about the modern rituals of self-abandonment people call normal. Waking up and reaching for the phone before your own thoughts. Checking whether someone texted back before checking how you actually feel. Posting something, then monitoring responses like your nervous system is being held hostage by strangers. Staying in relationships that drain you because emptiness feels scarier than dishonesty. Filling every quiet minute with podcasts, playlists, content, updates, and endless stimulation, not because all of it is meaningful, but because silence starts to feel like a threat. This is what no one says clearly enough: many people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of what becomes visible when there is nowhere left to hide. And that is exactly why solitude can become sacred. Because when you stop using the world to sedate yourself, you begin to recover the parts of yourself you traded away for belonging. At first, this recovery does not feel dramatic. It looks small. It looks like noticing how anxious you are when nobody validates you. It looks like realizing you don't actually enjoy certain conversations, you just fear what your absence might imply. It looks like sitting in a quiet apartment after work and discovering how much of your exhaustion was not from labor, but from emotional performance. It looks like spending a Saturday alone and confronting the strange emptiness that rises when no one is watching, praising, needing, or consuming you. Those moments do not look impressive from the outside. But inside, something serious is happening. You are withdrawing your identity from the crowd. And that process matters more than most people realize. Because a person who cannot be alone will eventually let the wrong people define them. They will stay too long where they are tolerated, beg too hard where they are merely used, and confuse attention for love simply because silence feels intolerable. But when solitude becomes familiar, your standards change. You no longer chase company at any cost. You begin to ask harder questions. Does this relationship bring peace or confusion? Does this room strengthen me or scatter me? Am I speaking because something true needs to be said, or because I'm panicking at the thought of being invisible? Am I building a life I respect, or decorating a life I secretly resent? This is where the Machiavellian edge appears, not in cruelty, not in manipulation, but in perception. Because when you stop craving immediate acceptance, you start seeing social life more clearly. You begin to notice who only respects what they cannot control. Who becomes uncomfortable when you stop over-explaining. Who loses interest when you stop performing need. Who called you different only because your silence exposed their dependence on noise. You start to see how many interactions are not built on sincerity, but on negotiation. How many smiles are strategic? How many invitations are transactional? How many bonds survive only as long as you remain useful, agreeable, or emotionally available on demand? That realization can sting. Sometimes it can break your heart. But it can also free you. Because once the false becomes visible, you stop mourning the mask as if it were the face. And this is one of the hidden gifts of solitude. It teaches you the difference between being wanted and being needed, between being seen and being used, between real connection and emotional consumption. Carl Jung said loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. That is why some people feel empty in crowded rooms and unexpectedly whole in silence. The issue is not always quantity of connection. Often, it is quality of contact, especially contact with yourself. There are people surrounded by friends who have never once felt deeply known. There are people in marriages who cannot speak honestly without triggering conflict, guilt, or performance. There are people whose phones never stop buzzing, yet their inner life feels abandoned. So yes, you can be surrounded and still be starving. Which means the solution was never mere proximity. The solution is truth. And truth usually arrives quietly. It arrives when you stop asking, "Why am I alone?" and begin asking, "What is this season trying to show me?" Maybe it is showing you how much of your identity was built around pleasing others. Maybe it is showing you that you have been calling self-betrayal adaptability. Maybe it is showing you that the life you built to be accepted is not the life your deeper self can actually breathe inside. Maybe it is showing you that you are more afraid of disappointing others than abandoning yourself. That is not a small discovery. That is a turning point. And yet this is where many people retreat. Because the early stage of solitude does not feel spiritual. It feels awkward. Embarrassing, even. It feels like sitting in a restaurant alone and wondering if people are judging you. It feels like walking into your apartment after work and hearing your own footsteps too clearly. It feels like spending a night without plans and suddenly confronting the restless itch to prove your life is still happening. It feels like being left on read and realizing how quickly your mind turns silence into a story about your worth. It feels like going a few days without external reassurance and discovering how dependent your mood has become on outside response. These are not abstract ideas. These are real moments. American life, especially modern urban and digital life, trains people to confuse stimulation with meaning and visibility with value. If something is not being affirmed, displayed, tracked, or reacted to, it begins to feel unreal. And that is precisely why solitude can feel so disorienting at first. It strips away the public mirror. Now you have to meet yourself without applause. And that is where the work begins. Epictetus said no man is free who is not master of himself. That line lands differently when you stop treating freedom as convenience and start treating it as sovereignty. Because what is self-mastery, really? It is not domination. It is not becoming emotionally numb. It is not pretending you no longer care. It is the ability to remain rooted when your usual sources of reassurance disappear. It is the refusal to let external chaos dictate internal law. It is knowing that your first responsibility is not to win every room, but to not lose yourself inside one. Solitude strengthens this because it removes your shortcuts. When no one is there to soothe you, flatter you, distract you, or interpret you, you are forced to build internal structure. You begin to regulate your own mind. You begin to observe the spirals instead of drowning inside them. You begin to catch the stories your insecurity writes before they become your reality. And this changes the way you live. You respond more slowly. You choose more carefully. You stop making permanent decisions from temporary emotional hunger. You stop calling panic intuition. You stop calling attachment destiny. You begin to trust yourself, not because life becomes easier, but because you are finally becoming someone who can stay present in difficulty without immediately running for sedation. That is real power. The world often teaches a counterfeit version of power. It says power is being admired, envied, followed, impossible to ignore. But much of that is dependency in costume. If your strength collapses the moment attention leaves, it was never strength. If your peace depends on being constantly chosen, praised, desired, or included, it is not peace. It is managed insecurity. Real power looks different. Real power is being able to walk into an empty season and not interpret it as personal failure. It is hearing less from the world and more from your conscience. It is being able to leave a table where your spirit is shrinking, even if that means eating alone for a while. It is refusing to entertain chaos just because quiet feels unfamiliar. It is building a life with so much inner substance that company becomes a choice, not a life support system. This is why solitude does not weaken worthy people. It clarifies them. History is full of people who found vision away from the crowd. Not because the crowd is always evil, but because crowds are noisy, reactive, and deeply susceptible to mood. The individual who can step away long enough to think without contagion gains something rare: perspective. Perspective is not glamorous, but it changes everything. It lets you see when a trend is stupid before participating. It lets you see when a conflict is beneath you before wasting energy. It lets you see when someone is provoking you only to gain access to your attention. It lets you see when loneliness is not a signal to settle, but a signal to deepen. And that deepening affects your relationships too. This part matters because some people here embrace solitude and imagine detachment in the coldest sense, shutting people out, becoming inaccessible, using distance as armor. But that is not strength. That is often just fear with better branding. Healthy solitude does not make you incapable of connection. It makes you capable of cleaner connection. When you no longer need people to rescue you from yourself, you stop forcing intimacy where there is no trust. You stop confusing chemistry with alignment. You stop staying available to people who only know how to value what they might lose. You stop overgiving just to earn permanence. You stop negotiating against your own dignity because you are afraid of quiet. And paradoxically, this is when your presence changes. People can feel when someone is not desperate. They can feel when someone is not begging to be chosen. They can feel when a person is standing in self-respect instead of emotional hunger. That kind of presence becomes magnetic, not because it is manipulative, but because it is rare. Most people have met confidence. Far fewer have met peace. And peace carries a different gravity. The person who can enjoy their own company, who can leave without theatrics, who can love without clinging, who can listen without performing, who can be still without panicking, that person unsettles the false and attracts the real. But to reach that point, you have to cross a difficult threshold. You have to stop romanticizing solitude and start practicing it honestly. That means you will meet your shadow. Not once. Repeatedly. You will discover that some of your loneliness is grief. Some of it is ego withdrawal. Some of it is withdrawal from stimulation itself. Some of it is the ache of becoming unfamiliar to people who benefited from your old shape. When you stop chasing, certain people disappear. When you stop over-explaining, some people call you cold. When you stop volunteering your energy for free, some people accuse you of changing. And maybe you have changed. Maybe that is the point. Growth often feels offensive to those who are comfortable with your self-neglect. So yes, solitude can cost you things. It can cost you the identity built around being needed. It can cost you access to rooms that only rewarded performance. It can cost you relationships that survived only on your overextension. But look closely. What exactly are you losing? Sometimes you are not losing love. You are losing theater. You are losing the role. You are losing the contract that required you to stay small so others could remain comfortable. And once that starts collapsing, your internal life begins reorganizing itself around something more honest. You start valuing peace over access. Depth over popularity. Restraint over reaction. Truth over image. Meaning over noise. This is why solitude can feel both painful and strangely clean. It removes what was cluttering your soul. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality. There is no modern arena where that is more obvious than loneliness. A person sits alone for one evening, and the mind immediately begins manufacturing interpretations. No one cares, everyone else is out living, I am behind, I am forgettable, I am failing at life. But what actually happened? Often, very little. A quiet night. A still room. An unfilled schedule. The suffering was not in the event. It was in the story. This is why solitude becomes transformative when paired with awareness. Because it teaches you to separate reality from interpretation. To notice that the mind, left undisciplined, will often weaponize silence against you. It will take neutral space and turn it into accusation. But if you stay present, if you refuse to let every feeling become a verdict, something changes. The room stops feeling like evidence. It starts feeling like space. And space is powerful. Space lets you think before reacting. Space lets grief rise without immediately medicating it. Space lets you ask whether your ambition is actually yours. Space lets you look at your habits without excuses. Space lets you notice which cravings are really just avoidance in disguise. This is why some of the strongest personal transformations do not begin with external success. They begin in private. Quietly. Without witnesses. They begin when a person gets tired of being emotionally rented out to the world. They begin when someone realizes they have spent years chasing proximity while neglecting self-respect. They begin when a woman or a man finally admits, I don't actually need more noise. I need more truth. That admission is not dramatic. But it can change a life. Because from there, solitude stops being a waiting room. It becomes a workshop. You start reading differently. Reflecting differently. Walking differently. You become more selective with your energy because you finally understand what it costs to rebuild inner coherence once it has been scattered. You stop letting every opinion enter you. You stop giving your nervous system to the algorithm. You stop letting emotional chaos pass as connection. And slowly, almost invisibly, you become someone else. Not someone harder. Someone clearer. Clearer about what drains you. Clearer about what matters. Clearer about what you can control and what you need to release. Clearer about the kind of life that is worth your finite energy. This is where the Stoic discipline becomes deeply practical. The dichotomy of control is not just philosophy on paper. It becomes a survival skill in solitude. When you are alone, especially in a painful season, the temptation is to fixate on everything outside your reach: who left, who misunderstood, who failed you, who chose someone else, who is doing better, who is not calling. But the Stoic asks a different question: what is mine to govern here? My attention. My interpretation. My standards. My next decision. My use of this moment. That shift sounds small, but it gives dignity back to the mind. Instead of drowning in what is absent, you begin building with what is present. Instead of demanding the world return something, you begin returning to yourself. And that return is where confidence starts becoming real. Not the loud confidence of slogans. The quieter kind. The kind built when you keep promises to yourself in private. When you do the walk without posting it. When you tell the truth in your journal instead of curating your image online. When you leave what degrades you without waiting for one more sign. When you can spend time alone without treating yourself like someone who has been abandoned. You begin to feel your own solidity. And once that solidity grows, the world's fluctuations stop hitting you with the same force. This does not mean life stops hurting. It means pain stops owning you. It also does not mean you no longer want love, friendship, community, or intimacy. That misunderstanding has damaged a lot of people. Some hear teachings like this and turn them into emotional exile. They decide that needing no one is the goal. But Stoic strength is not lovelessness. It is non-dependence. You can love deeply and still not lose yourself. You can be devoted and still maintain inner structure. You can connect warmly and still know how to return to yourself when the world gets noisy. In fact, some of the best relationships are only possible after solitude has done its work. Because only then do you meet others from wholeness instead of hunger. Only then can you distinguish genuine intimacy from mutual anesthesia. Only then can you love without turning the other person into your source code. This is what modern culture often gets backward. It tells people to find someone before helping them become someone. So they enter relationships looking for identity, regulation, rescue, and proof. Then they call it love when it is really dependence with chemistry. Solitude corrects that. Painfully, but beautifully. It teaches you to become a home before asking anyone else to live inside you. And that lesson reaches beyond romance. It changes your work, your friendships, your moral courage, your relationship to success itself. Because once you are less controlled by approval, you become less likely to betray your values for belonging. You stop saying yes just to avoid exclusion. You stop chasing every opportunity that flatters your ego. You stop performing certainty. You stop needing to be understood by everyone before making a serious move. Some of your boldest decisions will become possible only after you are no longer addicted to consensus. That is why solitude has always been a threshold for transformation. Not because isolation is inherently holy, but because noise makes self-betrayal easier to hide. In silence, your life becomes harder to fake. And that can feel brutal. You may discover that your calendar is full but your spirit is thin. That your social charm is strong but your self-respect is inconsistent. That you know how to entertain a room but not how to sit still without feeling restless. That you are admired for qualities that are exhausting to maintain. That some of what people love about you is precisely what is costing you your peace. These realizations can hurt. But they are clean hurts. They are the kind that lead somewhere. Because every honest confrontation in solitude removes one more layer of illusion. And illusion is expensive. It costs focus. It costs time. It costs dignity. It costs years. How many people spend half their lives performing the version of themselves that once earned safety, never questioning whether that version still reflects who they are? How many stay in social patterns long after their soul has outgrown them? How many keep reaching outward because no one ever taught them that inward stability could be built? This is why being alone can make you stronger. Not automatically. Not magically. But truthfully. Because if you use it well, solitude trains the exact capacities that the modern world keeps eroding: sustained attention, emotional regulation, self-observation, selective detachment, clarity of values, resistance to manipulation, freedom from image maintenance, and the ability to remain internally anchored while external conditions change. Those capacities do not merely make you feel better. They make you harder to destabilize. And in a world built on distraction, a person who cannot be easily destabilized becomes powerful. This is where many people start to notice something unexpected. The more they stop begging life to fill every silence, the more creative they become. Ideas return. Discernment returns. Energy returns. The mind, once no longer crowded by constant reaction, starts producing again. This is why so many thinkers, writers, philosophers, and builders protected solitude fiercely. Not because they hated people, but because they knew creation requires room. Insight requires room. Originality requires freedom from immediate social pressure. The crowd often imitates. The solitary mind, when healthy, can originate. And that applies to your life even if you are not an artist or philosopher. You are still creating something. Your character. Your standards. Your future. Your daily atmosphere. Your way of speaking, choosing, loving, enduring. If you never step back from the crowd, you may spend years building a life that is socially legible and internally false. Solitude gives you the chance to correct the blueprint. Now, this does not happen in one perfect spiritual breakthrough. It happens in repetitions. In small returns. In ordinary discipline. You close the app. You take the walk. You let the discomfort rise without obeying it. You sit with the thought instead of escaping it. You write down what is actually true. You begin to notice which people leave you heavier and which leave you cleaner. You stop treating your own company as a backup plan. And over time, the emotional climate changes. What once felt like punishment begins to feel like protection. What once felt empty begins to feel uncluttered. What once felt like rejection begins to feel like separation from what was never aligned. This is a profound shift. Because when loneliness transforms into chosen solitude, your entire relationship to life changes. You stop asking the world to constantly reassure you. You start asking yourself better questions. What am I becoming through this season? What habits does this silence expose? What illusions can no longer survive here? What kind of man, what kind of woman, can be built if I stop running now? These are stronger questions than, why is this happening to me? They give suffering direction. They turn discomfort into material. And that is perhaps the deepest reframe of all: solitude is not the absence of life. It is often the place where life becomes legible. Without the noise, you can finally hear the pattern. You can finally see where you keep betraying yourself. You can finally tell the difference between desire and conditioning. You can finally sense which parts of your identity are alive and which are inherited performances. That kind of awareness is worth more than many forms of popularity. Because popularity can disappear. Access can disappear. Validation can disappear. But self-possession, once built honestly, becomes difficult to take from you. And self-possession changes the way you move through every room afterward. You become less reactive. Less explainable. Less seducible by shallow approval. You no longer need to win every misunderstanding. You no longer chase every invitation. You no longer pour your energy into proving your worth to people who only recognize spectacle. Instead, you carry something steadier. A groundedness. A private coherence. A sense that even if the room goes quiet, you will not disappear with it. That is why the strongest people are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones who have survived enough silence to stop fearing it. The ones who have faced their own mind enough times to stop being ruled by every passing emotion. The ones who have learned that discomfort is not always a warning, it is often an initiation. And yes, there is a final caution here. Because near the beginning I told you I would return to the mistake so many people make when they first try to embrace solitude. Here it is. They turn solitude into self-rejection. They isolate, but they do not reflect. They withdraw, but only to rehearse their pain. They sit alone, but use the silence to attack themselves, judge themselves, replay old wounds, and deepen the belief that they are unwanted. That is not the solitude we are talking about. That is abandonment turned inward. Healthy solitude is not a courtroom where you prosecute yourself. It is a place of observation, restoration, and truth. It is where you meet yourself honestly enough to change, but gently enough to stay. You are not meant to use silence as another weapon against your own spirit. You are meant to use it to hear what your life has been trying to tell you beneath the noise. So if you are in a season where the room feels quieter than you expected, do not rush to label it failure. Do not rush to fill it with the nearest distraction or the nearest person willing to occupy the space. Sit long enough to understand what this season is revealing. Maybe it is revealing your dependence on approval. Maybe it is revealing your strength. Maybe it is showing you where your standards were too low. Maybe it is preparing you to build a life that is not performed, but owned. Because when you master solitude, you do not become cold. You become clear. You become difficult to manipulate. You become harder to bait, harder to rush, harder to deceive with surface-level noise. You become more selective with your heart, your time, your voice, your energy. And from that selectiveness comes a different kind of freedom. A freedom not based on escape, but on self-command. So the next time life gets quiet, remember this: not every empty room is a punishment. Not every lonely season is a detour. Not every silence means you are forgotten. Sometimes the world gets quiet because your soul can no longer hear itself in the crowd. Sometimes life removes the noise because noise was making you weak. Sometimes being alone is the forge. And if you are brave enough to stay there long enough, you will not come out emptier. You will come out sharper, calmer, cleaner, more real. You will come out as someone who no longer needs constant proof in order to stand tall. Someone who can love without clinging, choose without fear, walk away without collapse, create without permission, and face the world without borrowing an identity from it. That is the power of being alone. Not because solitude makes you less human, but because it gives you back the parts of yourself the world taught you to trade away. If this spoke to where you are right now, let it stay with you for a while. And if you've ever gone through a season where solitude changed you, where the silence hurt at first, but eventually showed you who you really were, share that in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know which part of this journey felt most familiar to you. And if you want more of these deeper StoicCraft reflections on self-respect, emotional discipline, silence, power, and how to stay grounded in a performative world, subscribe and stay close. Not for noise. For clarity. Because out there, the crowd will always be loud. But in here, we practice hearing what remains when the noise finally breaks. And sometimes, that is where your real life begins.